Good morning, everyone. First, let me say welcome and thank you for joining our webinar this morning. Today, we have the pleasure of having Professor Alex Bellamy, Dr. Bhatara, and Dr. Lina to speak about Indonesia's recent no vote on a UN resolution regarding the responsibility to protect. I think this is an important vote. I don't think we should just dismiss it as just a blip in Indonesian foreign policy. And I think it has serious consequences for how we do our foreign policy in the future. Before we begin, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Vermonte as the Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia, who will open with some opening remarks. Dr. Phillips, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ivan. Very good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on R2P. As we all know, in May, there was a vote took place in the UN, and Indonesia voted no for the R2P. And for us at CSIS, this kind of webinar that we are having today partly is we consider it as our duty to the public as well as to the academia, and on how we make sense of the vote that Indonesia had decided in the UN last May. And of course, we are very happy to have experts on this issue. Thank you, Professor Alex. Thank you for Alex Bellamy, Professor Alex Bellamy, Director of the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect, R2P, who has been following, advocating, researching on the issue of R2P, for joining us and giving us your precious time to be with us this morning. Also, I think we should thank our colleague, Indonesian colleague, Dr. Bhatara Ibnu Reza, a lecturer at the Bhyangkara Jaya University, for joining us as well, and will give his thought on the matter. And in particular, I thank Dr. Lina Alexandra, our senior researcher of CSIS, who also has been following the issue pretty closely in the past few years. And as we know, the vote took place in the circumstance as such that Indonesia is actually pursuing some kind of activism in our foreign policy. We are in the middle of the problem in Myanmar, and then there has been conflicts going on in between Palestine and Israeli and so on and so forth. That would require some sort of, or at least some level of some kind of interventionist thinking, if I may. But let the speakers discuss the matter more in the discussion, and I hope we are all going to have a fruitful discussion and to add into the ongoing discourse in the public as well as in the academia in Indonesia and beyond. Thank you. Back to you, Evan.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips, for an opening remarks. Before we begin, let me set a bit of a context for the audience out there. As Dr. Phillips mentioned, we had a recent vote at the UNGA on 18th of May. And then on the May 20th, our foreign minister was also in New York to fight for the issue of Palestine. So I think we should not take the vote lightly. I think there are three key issues that I hope that we can discuss quite intensely and quite seriously today. One is the series of logical fallacies that has been proposed as our response to why we voted no, particularly from the Indonesian Foreign Ministry. There's a series of those, which I think my colleague will discuss further. But one of the most inconsistent position, I think, has to do with the fact that on the one hand, the Foreign Ministry claims that this is nothing more than a procedural vote. And yet, on the other hand, they have publicly acknowledged that Indonesia has some concerns or reservations regarding the concept of R2P itself. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. You gotta have to choose one. And those two things are mutually exclusive. Are you concerned with the substance of R2P, or this is simply a procedural vote and therefore it doesn't really matter? The second point, I think that's also important, that this is not just about the R2P vote, that this speaks about the larger questions and issues in how the Indonesian foreign policy is being made. The foreign policy process, I think, is important because it speaks to two things. One, that the foreign policy instrument of Indonesia takes into account the views and concerns of those outside of the foreign ministry in how the country conducts its foreign policy. And R2P, as we can see in Indonesia, the debate has been pretty resonant, and that shows that since the last 20 years, the Indonesian public, civil society groups, and research institutes are also part of Indonesian foreign policy. So therefore, those concerns should not be dismissed out of hand. And secondly, I think it bears repeating that the no vote wasn't the only option on the table. We could have voted abstain, we could have voted yes, just like the rest of the world did, and yet we chose no. We need to know, I think, what was the particular thought process behind that no vote, that you weighed the pros and cons. What would have happened if we had voted abstain, or had we voted yes, and what would have happened had we voted no? And now that we voted no, I think this is a problem because the third point, this relates to the detachment of the foreign policy making process at the UN from the wider strategic context that Indonesia is operating at this point, particularly as my colleagues mentioned earlier, we were in the midst of trying to fight for a much more peaceful resolution to the crisis in Myanmar. We were definitely in the midst of fighting for a resolution to the crisis in Palestine. And we have been at the forefront of normative leadership in how we address crisis all over the world, including in Afghanistan. So to have a no vote, we would have to know what could have been the thought process behind the no vote, that this was seen as a worthy step to take and undermine Indonesia's wider strategic context. With these three key points in mind, I'd like to invite Professor Alex Bellamy to give his presentation and remarks about the R2P itself and how this relates to the global norms and Indonesia's ability to navigate that global norms. Professor Bellamy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Philip and Evan, for inviting me to be part of this, and a special thanks to Lina as well. It's lovely to see our most recent Australian exports there in Jakarta doing such a great job. Thanks, Lina. So I'm going to keep my comments very brief and focus on the three things that Lina asked me to talk about. Firstly, what R2P is and is not. Secondly, focus a bit more specifically on R2P's controversial third pillar, and then briefly reflect on R2P at the General Assembly. So I'm not, in my comments, going to be specifically talking about the Indonesian vote, as you're all much more expert than I am to comment on that. So quickly, when we're thinking about R2P, it's important to begin with recognizing that this is a demand-driven norm. If anyone doesn't think it's demand-driven, just take a look at the placards being held by protesters in Myanmar saying, we want R2P. We have R2P because populations want protection from mass atrocity crimes, and they believe that their governments and the international community sometimes fails to provide that core protection. And for as long as the international community doesn't get its answers right to this question of how you prevent mass atrocities and how you respond effectively to it, we're going to have crisis after crisis after crisis. This isn't going to go away, and demands for R2P aren't going to go away just by us wishing that it goes away. This demand arises out of the fact that we still have genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing in our world, and we have a shared expectation that people should be protected from these crimes. And that's important to say as well, that there is a shared moral normative expectation that these crimes are wrong, they are abhorrent, and we should work together to make sure that they don't happen. Nobody sits in the General Assembly or anywhere else at the UN and says, you know what, we think it's okay that atrocity crime still exists. That's fine. Everyone agrees they're not fine. They need to be prevented. Now, historians trying to trace the roots of R2P trace them to Africa. It's important to recognize that this is not a Western doctrine. This was a doctrine first developed in Africa. The African Union, in its constitution, has a concept of R2P and had it there before anybody else in the world came up with it. The original ideas of sovereignty as responsibility were developed by a guy called Francis Deng, who's from South Sudan. The commission that first came up with the idea of R2P was co-chaired by Mohamed Sarnoun, who's from Algeria. The whole concept was marshaled through the UN General Assembly by Kofi Annan, who's from Ghana. One of the countries most opposed to R2P in 2005 was George W. Bush's United States. In fact, the US did more than almost anyone else to try and scupper consensus on R2P. And it's important to recognize where this concept comes from and why. And as I've mentioned, this demand for R2P will not disappear. And so the choice before the international community is, do we try to fulfill these demands for protection through existing institutions and laws? And that's what R2P is trying to do. Or do we block those existing institutions and laws? In which case, what people and interested states will do is go around those institutions and laws. These demands for protection will still exist. There will still be those who want to fulfill those demands for protection. And if we don't create institutional and legal routes for that to happen, people can and will go around those institutions. And my sense, and I think the view of the General Assembly when it signed on to R2P, is that that is a recipe for a more disorderly world than we have if we bring it together and work on it through our existing institutions. Now, none of this is kind of new or alien. In fact, it's right there in the UN Charter, and everything about R2P is related to what's already there in the UN Charter. So Article 55 of the UN Charter says it is the UN's job to promote universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, and nothing challenges those fundamental freedoms more than atrocity crimes, and genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. R2P, as has already been said, was agreed by consensus in 2005, and since 2005, it has featured in 92 Security Council resolutions, most recently just in the past March on resolutions on South Sudan. So this was not a passing fad or one-off from the General Assembly. There are now 92 Security Council resolutions referencing R2P. There are also 58 Human Rights Council resolutions referencing R2P. Again, most recently, just 2 months ago in March, resolutions on South Sudan, North Korea, and Syria. We've had 10 annual reports from the UN, 4 formal debates of the UN General Assembly. So this year's formal debate was not the first, it was actually the 4th. There have also been a number of informal debates as well. And during that time, if you just count up the number of states that have said that they support R2P, that have explicitly said those words, and they include Indonesia more than once, you get to a number in excess of 140 states. Now, what is R2P? Firstly and conceptually, it's important to recognize that R2P is a political commitment. It arises out of a resolution of the UN General Assembly, and those are political commitments. And it's a political commitment to implement existing legal obligations through legal means. States already have a legal obligation, not just to not commit these atrocity crimes, but also to ensure and promote compliance with international humanitarian law. It's right there at the beginning of the Geneva Conventions. And R2P is a commitment to implement those obligations through existing law. So through this thing here, the UN Charter, there is nothing in R2P that allows anybody to do anything not consistent with the UN Charter. R2P is limited to these 4 defined atrocity crimes of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. It's not for every single war. It's not for every human security problem. It's for these specific atrocity crimes. It doesn't create additional legal obligations or authorities. It doesn't give someone a legal right to use force that they didn't have before R2P. and nor does it try to do any of those things. It doesn't try to change the law either. And it's something that the UN Security Council and the Human Rights Council have used in relation to a wide variety of different contexts. So, you know, we talk a lot about Libya, but we need to bear in mind that Libya is only one of more than a dozen situations where the UN Security Council has explicitly referred to R2P in relation to, and I'll come back to some of those other examples in a moment if I've got time, and I might not. What R2P is, as you all know, is these three equal non-sequential pillars. Firstly, the primary responsibility of the state to protect its own population. Secondly, the responsibility of the international community to encourage and assist the state. And thirdly, the responsibility of the international community to use diplomatic and humanitarian means to protect populations. And should that fail, for the Security Council to take timely and decisive action to protect populations. So that's R2P. Now let's get on to the controversial third pillar, and apologies for putting in full the text of what was agreed in 2005. But I think it's important that we have the actual text of the agreement, because there are so many kind of myths and misunderstandings around the third pillar of R2P. And this is what it says: the international community, through the United Nations, has the responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means in accordance with chapters 6 and 8 of the Charter to help protect populations from those 4 crimes. In this context, we, the member states of the UN, are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council in accordance with the Charter, including chapter 7, etc., etc. Now, what are the key things here? Firstly, we have a kind of a 2-step process. The first step in the third pillar is the use of humanitarian and other peaceful measures in accordance with chapters 6 and 8 of the Charter. And as you all know, the Charter elaborates on those in detail, and UN practice elaborates on those in detail. And these are measures undertaken with the consent of the state involved. It says that the Security Council is prepared to act in a timely manner in accordance with the Charter should those peaceful means be inadequate. Now, the important thing here is that the UN Security Council doesn't get its authority to do any of this from R2P. It gets its authority from the UN Charter, and it's had that authority and it's used that authority since 1945. So there's nothing in R2P that suddenly allows the Security Council to do anything that it couldn't have already done before 2005, and in fact sometimes did do before 2005. So that authority that is so controversial with respect to R2P already exists, and it was there at the foundation of the UN when people joined it all the way back in the 1940s and 50s. There is nothing, and I would challenge anyone to find in this text anything that erodes the concept of sovereignty beyond anything that's in the UN Charter, and anything that's in there that gives any state permission to intervene in the affairs of another state beyond that already found in Chapter 7 and Article 51 of the Charter. It's simply not there. And had it been there, of course, you wouldn't have gotten the agreement in 2005 in the first place. Now, in practice, I've mentioned before, but I'll put this up and you can have my slides. But I just wanted to emphasize as my kind of final point that R2P is being applied. It is being used. These are all cases where the UN Security Council has explicitly referred to the responsibility to protect. And in doing so, it's referred to it in different ways. It's used different combinations of measures. But just to give you a kind of a sense of the broad range of which the council is using it. And primarily, you'll see 2 things that come up over and over again. One, it's in the context of peace operations. That is by far the most common form of response to atrocity crimes and the protection of civilians. Peace operations with protection of civilians mandates. But you'll see other things in there, including the use of force in Libya, including criminal justice in other cases. But we've got a broad scope of measures. We've got different levels of success. Sometimes these have been more successful than other times. There is no simple template to addressing these problems. Neither does anyone have a kind of a magical key that can give you the key to success. The Security Council is learning and developing as it goes and as it has always done. So that is my kind of brief kind of overview of where R2P is, the broader nature of some of the key conceptual debates, and a little kind of look at the practice of R2P in the UN Security Council. Just one final point, because the thing that comes up over and over again with concern about the third pillar is the potential for the third pillar to be abused by powerful states to justify armed intervention in the affairs of others, primarily unilateral intervention. Two things are worth bearing in mind in that regard. Firstly, there is nothing in R2P as agreed that provides a basis on which to do that. And bear in mind, states found lots of different ways to justify unilateral intervention before R2P came along. So we think, for example, of the US invasion of Iraq. That came in 2003 and had nothing at all to do with R2P. Secondly, since 2005, I can't think of a single case of a state intervening unilaterally with the use of force in another state, citing R2P as the primary reason for doing so. What happened in Libya is and remains controversial, and it's rightly so that we should debate and argue about it. But the fact remains that that intervention was clearly authorized by the UN Security Council. It was not an act of unilateralism by NATO or the US or anybody else. And I think we would search in vain to find an example of unilateral military intervention justified primarily by reference to R2P. So thanks very much. Oh, hang on, final point, sorry, I forgot about this a little bit at the end about procedural and substantive that Lina asked me to talk about. Another quote from the World Summit Outcome document. This is what the General Assembly agreed to do in 2005. They agreed that there was a need for the General Assembly to continue its consideration of R2P. But if we're going to implement this principle, we need debate, we need consultation, we need to learn lessons, and we need to collect inputs from around the world in a way that's not controlled by a small group of states like the Security Council or the Human Rights Council. The most inclusive forum for doing that is the General Assembly. And the 2005 agreement explicitly makes a commitment to continuing consideration in the GA. So I think that's the first point to make, is that we have this text from 2005 that everyone agreed to that says the GA is going to continue its consideration of R2P. Now, in practice, I know some people make big distinctions between procedural and substantive resolutions. In practice, if you spend as much of your life as I've spent reading General Assembly resolutions, and I don't recommend it because it's not the most exciting thing to do with your time, you'll find that actually lots of resolutions contain both procedural and substantive elements, in that they talk about what the GA might do in the future, as well as making comment. There's certainly nothing in the Charter and nothing in the General Assembly's practice that says some resolutions are of one nature and other resolutions are of another. The reality has always been much messier than that. And finally, and I know I said I wasn't going to comment on Indonesia, but one little comment on Indonesia. I find it perplexing that an argument in favor of, an argument supporting a vote to not debate something is made with an argument that we need more debate. Surely, if you want to have more debate about R2P, if you want to have more views about R2P, if you want the General Assembly to be the one driving it and not the Security Council and not a small group of friends, surely you would want to have this debate in the General Assembly, to have states' opinions recorded, noted, and properly accorded, and to give every state in the UN an opportunity to comment and have its views heard. Experts on Indonesian foreign policy, you all will be no doubt be able to unpick this argument more, but for an outsider like me, it just seems like an illogical flow of argument. But interestingly, Indonesia is not the first government, even in this region, to make that argument. Another one that did was Malaysia 12 years ago. When Malaysia 12 years ago had a position similar to Indonesia's today, Malaysian diplomats made much the same argument. Malaysia's position has changed considerably since 2012. They no longer make that argument. Now, Malaysian diplomats will say things like, well, we had that debate and we looked at it in more details, particularly when we were sitting on the UN Security Council, and our position as a result have shifted. And it's interesting, I think, but the argument that we've heard some Indonesian diplomats making is identical to the argument that some Malaysian diplomats were making 12 years ago. And what we saw a few weeks ago was Malaysia vote yes to this resolution, having gone through the same sorts of debates that Indonesia is having now. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alex, for that very illuminating presentation. And I think that last 2 points that you make, that it is a huge contradiction to say that you would like to have more debate and then we voted no. And the fact that Malaysia had reached this conclusion 12 years ahead of us is something that I think our foreign policy makers should pay serious attention to. To the next speaker, the floor is yours, Dr. Bhatara, Ibnu Reza. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evan, and good morning, and thank you for having me. Actually, I don't have any specific presentation. However, CSIS asked me to focus on 2 general issues, like a possible rationales why Indonesia reject the R2P resolutions and the problem with them, and why R2P matters for Indonesia. And as Alex already explained, as you know, that Indonesia first is reluctant with the concept. However, they accepted officially during President SBY. Indonesia has participated in 4 of the 9 UN General Assembly informal interactive dialogue on R2P from 2013 2016. Correct me if I'm wrong. And Indonesia is particularly strong in foreign assistance and peacekeeping. Indonesia also actively engaged and involved in resolving, for example, recently Myanmar military coup by using Asian Forum, and long-standing supporter of Palestine struggles. However, she has a gap that Indonesia not ratified 1948 Genocide Conventions, the additional protocols of 1949 Geneva Conventions, 1951 Refugee Conventions, and also the Rome Statute. Main position in R2P, I mean, as Indonesia is focused on protections, responsibilities of states, or Pillar 1, and international assistance and capacity building, or Pillar 2, in the framework of respecting state sovereignty. This position, which is still held by Indonesia in her diplomacy, especially in relations to human rights and humanitarian issues. In other words, that R2P should not endangering state sovereignty and condemning any foreign interventions and political interference. For example, I do some research on this, like back in 2010 during the review conference in Kampala. Indonesian views that interpretation of the unwilling and unable of the states and as trigger mechanism for the court to exercise jurisdiction over the situations. Indonesia statement on that conference was, I quote, in relations to the principle of complementarity, Indonesia re-emphasized the importance of paragraph 10 of the preamble and article 17 of the statutes. The concept of inability and unwillingness should not serve easily as a pretext to provide continuous reference to ICC interventions. So this is actually Indonesians' view during the review conference of the Rome Statute back in 2010. Actually, Asian countries have pretty much the same position like Indonesia. In R2P draft resolution, some of Asian countries emphasize the issues of state sovereignty and objections of interference. For example, Philippines delegate stated that the responsibility to protect must never use as a pretext to interfere with any state's affairs. So this is actually almost the same like Indonesian position in the review conference of the Rome Statutes. However, as you know, like Alex explained, that Philippines say yes to the resolutions. Meanwhile, Malaysia is also raised the same issue, where Malaysia delegate statement was highlighting that the principle of state sovereignty and consent must, however, remain paramount when considering international assistance. And secondly, in their statement that responsibility to protect principle still requires in-depth discussion to elaborate clear definition before being accepted as an international norm. So this is very interesting. Like you know, Indonesia vote no, because the responsibility to protect doesn't need to be a standing annual agenda item. Moreover, Indonesia delegate said Indonesia's position should not be mistaken as against the responsibility to protect. On the other hand, the IMF spokesperson explained to the public, our public here in Indonesia, that the rejection mainly was not R2P substance, but it was procedural, which is very confused to us. It is like separating the sugar and sweetness. However, unlike Indonesia, the countries like Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand are in favor to these solutions. Meanwhile, other 5 ASEAN countries vote abstain. A country like Singapore, for example, has similar objection regarding R2P as an annual agenda item. The reason of Singapore absent from the vote because it is incumbent on member states to build trust and find common ground on the issue. The draft resolution represents a missed opportunity as it imposes an annual agenda item without making any effort to do so. So, I mean, that's Singapore give a robust explanations why the country actually against the resolutions. However, like Lina in his opinion in Jakarta Post said, if it doesn't have anything to do with the substance, our question is why bother voting no? There is no robust explanation to our public, but probably that Indonesia doesn't want to expand the R2P in a specific agenda in UN because it would be a naming and shaming forum for her in the framework of respecting human rights. Back in the day when UN Commission on Human Rights until the establishment of Human Rights Council in 2006, the procedure is changing. Used to be commission, in UN Commission on Human Rights, the civil society together with the networks can do diplomacy, naming and shaming, condemning the state practice on human rights. However, the probably that Indonesia vote no is it is because some experts said it's Papua issues. But again, this is have several consequences. It means for Indonesia is taking human rights seriously in UNGA. I mean that's since Indonesia is lost together with other 15 countries who say against the resolution. It means there are 2 possible things that Indonesia do. First is not participating in the R2P special agenda or attending the becoming a participant. However, for me is do not send a junior diplomat for replying the statement of other countries, especially in the issues of Papua. Because right now, human rights is really becoming a serious issue, especially in General Assembly. The impacts, of course, for us in Indonesia, it's against the will of the Constitution, where Indonesia pledged to participate towards the establishment of a world order based on the freedom, perpetual peace, and social justice. This is actually our pledge in paragraph 4 of our constitutions, preamble of our constitutions. And also human rights as the constitutional rights of the citizens, where the state has duties to respect, to protect, and to fulfill the human rights. Moreover, the Indonesia position has also counterproductive with Indonesia commitment in resolving Myanmar crisis and Palestine as the 3rd largest of democracy, but end up in the same boat with some countries which condemn human rights. Indonesia should support R2P as part of encouraging domestic legal and political development in respecting human rights and combating impunity. Thank you very much, Evan, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Let's move on now to our last and final speaker, Dr. Lina Alexandra from CSIS. Dr. Lina, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Evan. First of all, it's been very nice to listening to Alex again. I mean, like his elaboration on R2P is always enlightening, and thank you to Bhatara as well for this presentation, excellent presentation as well. First of all, I would like to say thanks for the comments, reply to my article previously in Jakarta Post on May 22 that basically contained criticisms on Indonesia's vote no to the UN resolution on R2P. But I think this incident is a blessing in disguise. It helps to reinvoke attention on R2P from the Indonesian public in particular, especially among the IR students as well as policymakers, on why R2P really matters for Indonesia. But also, it's reinvoking attention on R2P from the wider public, the international public as well. So my presentation today will address two key points. The first thing, according to the title of this webinar, is to rectify the logical fallacies on R2P. And second is the implication of this no vote to Indonesia's diplomacy in pursuing other significant foreign policy agenda. So on the first one, first note, why it is not only a procedural matter. I would like to explain this by highlighting the official explanatory statement prior to the vote provided by the Indonesian officials. First, it is argued that R2P does not need a standing annual agenda item. Reason? It is because numerous informal UN debates and reports by the UNFG have been made to discuss R2P, as it is clear in Alex's presentation. Four formal debates and 7 informal debates. Question: does it make sense to say that because there are numerous debates and reports on R2P have been made, then it is not necessary any longer for R2P to become a standing annual agenda item in UNGA? How much is actually too much? If we agree on the content of R2P, making it to be discussed as a standing annual agenda item of the GA is not changing anything. It actually makes the debates and reports more dignified, ensuring that R2P situations is to be discussed properly by the UN member states, without having to worry whether it will or will not be addressed, depending on the consensus of voting among the member states. The second is, this is really the key, as Bhatara mentioned also. This is really the key thing that makes us confused. Because the statement from the officials blatantly exposed itself that Indonesia is having cautiousness over the principle. I quote, like it says that since long ago, Indonesia's reluctance to make R2P a permanent agenda point of the UNGA has lingered around cautiousness over the immature content of the R2P. Furthermore, it is worrisome that R2P action is primarily aimed at weak states, while it is very unlikely to be applied against the powerful ones. What do these statements imply? It testifies that Indonesia is clearly having problems with R2P substantively, not procedurally. The content of R2P being perceived as immature, and R2P action is applied primarily to the weak states, while the powerful states are untouchable. Is the perception wrong? It is not. Many countries may also share or have the same concern. This is understandable since the implementation of Pillar 3 of R2P requires continuous debate to prevent what many countries have been anxious or fear about. R2P should not be an entry point for intervention. Greater caution, as said, is necessary, and we all agree on this. But saying no to the what official says as procedural resolution, although Alex's presentation clearly mentioned there's no such thing as different between procedural and substantive resolution. But by saying no does not change anything. Having greater caution is not equal to being parallel. Because we have some concerns on R2P, this is exactly the reason why we need to upgrade the discussion room by making R2P as an annual permanent agenda where we can argue, debate substantively on how R2P should be implemented and be made mature. If we agree on the resolution, then we also contribute in guaranteeing that prevention of serious crimes to humanity always come to the attention of the international community. Third, Indonesia's voting position should not be mistaken as against R2P, because it is saying no to the resolution. My opinion, it does not take a genius to differentiate whether this is a procedural or substantive UN agenda that Indonesia is voting no. Of course, it is very obvious by the time you see the draft. I think as many IR departments since long ago has practiced the UN model for students to get to know about UN. This is not something only for the senior diplomats to know. Again, the point is why Indonesia is saying no to a procedural agenda if not having substantive disagreement. How can we separate Indonesia's no vote with its standpoint against R2P substantively? By saying Indonesia disagree with the procedure of how R2P is to be discussed, now formally and more dignified, not only as a topping informal agenda among others, how can we avoid any interpretation that Indonesia is having problems with R2P substantively? To put it simple, if you are having problem to move R2P discussion into a formal meeting room, and rather to have it continuously in a closet room, where it can or cannot be discussed depending on the mood of everyone, it only tells us a clear message. Indonesia is not happy with R2P, period. Impacts to Indonesia's foreign policy pursuit. My biggest concern is on the ramifications of Indonesia's no vote to its pursuit toward other specific foreign policy objectives. And looking at from this perspective, it is a fatal mistake. How? Because as my colleagues already mentioned earlier, Indonesia is currently building its credibility and image as peace builder, contributor to international peace and security. But at the same time, it is projecting the image that Indonesia is being in the same group with those countries that are troublemakers. And I have been criticized by saying this. But I think it's very clear, as Bhatara already mentioned as well. Look at the configurations of the vote. Indonesia cannot avoid the impression that we are now in the same group with countries that are violating human rights. And indeed, there are some countries in ASEAN that are actually having very real problems with human rights. They are voting for yes in this resolution. And foreign policy is about creating and sustaining image with actions. On one hand, Indonesia is seeking to create a branding as contributed to peace by being a peacekeepers contributors, for example. On the other hand, it obviously stays in the same group with other 14 countries that is committing serious human rights violations. Creating and more importantly, projecting the consistent image is extremely crucial in pursuing our foreign policy objectives. And specifically, Indonesia's no vote has given a bad precedent for Indonesia's eagerness to play crucial roles in at least two brewing issues, Myanmar and Palestine. As Alex mentioned earlier, it's a demand-driven principle. And we all know in so many media that that Myanmar people has been calling for this principle, calling for R2P to help to save Myanmar. And while at the same time, Indonesia is saying no to R2P. And we came across Twitter saying that by questioning Indonesia's inconsistent position in this. Indonesia is pushing ASEAN maybe we put quotation here, pushing ASEAN to intervene, because that's the reality that we see, and we want intervene in helping the Myanmar people to solve the crisis in the country. But at the same time, it is being so paranoid about R2P. And as it is very clear in the principle itself, intervene can certainly also mean facilitating, mediating, creating good office, and all other peaceful means. It does not always refer to military intervention. And the other issue is Palestine. Indonesia has maintained a very strong position of condemning Israeli attacks to Palestine. This is a clear human rights violation. But Israel says yes to the resolution. Israel should be the one that is so afraid to this principle, while Indonesia saying that it is actually advancing, championing human rights. But we are actually the one that is so paranoid about this principle. This is the era where foreign policy is no longer something to be done behind closed doors, away from being under public scrutiny. It is really sad if our diplomats still cannot comprehend this. Just like war is too important to be left to the generals, foreign policy issue is also too important to be left to the diplomats only. So it is very important to be very careful making certain decisions, as everyone, our public, as well as the international audience, are watching us. To conclude, Professor Bellamy mentioned in his tweet when Indonesia voted no. Indonesia pushing the wrong button. I remember a couple of years ago when I was still being supervised by him for my PhD study. He sent me a copy of Indonesia's statement on R2P, which essentially underlined Indonesia's continuous support to the R2P principle. For me, he is one of the most optimistic persons I've ever known, including by believing that Indonesia has made its standpoint on R2P loud and clear. However, at this stage, I'm afraid I have to be quite honest and frank with him. Indonesia is not pushing the wrong button. It makes its standpoint clear. After almost 2 decades of 2005 World Summit Outcome document, Indonesia is still very much confused with the principle and even cannot say or cannot fully embrace R2P, which unfortunately been expressed through gesturing instead of having a substantive debate on this. I'm not saying that we cannot criticize R2P, but we need to make our stand clear whenever needed to fight against the biggest evil of humanity. We should not be paranoid with R2P. It is an instrument for self-reflection, whether the responsibility to protect the people has been carried out to the maximum. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina, for an excellent and incisive response to how Indonesia has tried to justify its no vote. I think from our three presenters over the past 45 minutes or so, I think it should be clear by now that number one, it is hard to accept the idea that we can separate easily between procedural issue and a substantive issue with regards to the responsibility to protect. Number two, even if hypothetically we could do so, in practice, you cannot justify it on both grounds. Then you can justify that it's a procedural issue, but by the way, we also have concerns substantively over the issue. This is a clear contradiction in terms. And I think most importantly, all three speakers have highlighted that Indonesia has built that strategic capital over the years as a peace builder, as a country who believes in the principles of human rights across the globe, and that we will seek to defend those who are voiceless, as seen in regards to Myanmar and Palestine. And I think that point was very poignant because as it stands right now, Indonesia's efforts to help address the crisis in Myanmar depends on Indonesia's strategic capital within ASEAN and depends on the perception of the people in Myanmar that Indonesia is willing to fight for them. that vote was noted very harshly within the civil society groups in Myanmar. That makes it harder for Indonesia to play a much more important role in the resolution to the crisis in Myanmar. So to say that this is merely a procedural issue, we have no problems and that things are fine, I think is a huge understatement. And this, I think, is something that our foreign policy makers should pay more close attention to, that the kinds of considerations that they simply consider as procedural have significant strategic ramifications for Indonesia's foreign policy. Now let's begin the Q&A session. We have two questions to Professor Bellamy from Muhammad Karisma. First question to Professor Bellamy: how do you apply that third clause of the R2P, including the peaceful and diplomatic means, when there is no clear legitimate national authority on the part of the target state where atrocities were committed? Second, I would like to ask your opinion on the significance of this UNGA resolution. Thus, including the R2P to the GA's annual agenda entails any milestone to the R2P debate? And in what way does the resolution's adoptions really harm the interests of developing countries like Indonesia? Professor Bellamy, if you would kindly respond to these two questions.
Great, thanks very much, and great questions, Mohammed. On the first, I'm always cautious about suggesting responses to kind of general situation or situation where we don't know the details of what situation we're talking about, because each situation is different, and we need to begin whenever we're thinking about a situation with a good understanding of what that situation is and what points of leverage there are, what the needs are, and what the best policy responses would be. Now, looking at the question, I think a lot of your question hinges on this use of the word legitimate authorities. Now, the question of what counts as a legitimate authority is one, of course, that governments will debate and dispute, but there are institutions that can define what a legitimate national authority is for us. One, of course, is the UN Security Council. And in the case, for example, of Côte d'Ivoire in 2011, the UN Security Council made a determination about an election result, and it decided on a series of consequences that flow from that. And as a result of that, the Security Council and UN peacekeepers helped prevent Côte d'Ivoire slipping into armed conflict. But if the Security Council is blocked, you could look for a determination from the General Assembly itself. The GA can't give you a legally binding determination, but it could certainly, a vote of the GA can tell you the opinions of member states. And if it's a strong vote in one direction, that can tell you something important. And of course, the General Assembly can also ask the International Court of Justice. Now, how then the International Court of Justice or somebody else would answer that question would then shape what you can and can't do in terms of political and humanitarian means, particularly on the humanitarian front, because of course, national legislation will determine whether humanitarian supplies can be delivered and where they can be delivered and how they can be delivered, unless you can also get a Security Council resolution. But in many cases, you know, national governments are not so hostile. You know, in many cases, it is possible to get support humanitarian supplies in. Many times it is possible to support civil society within the legal framework of the national state involved. And one of the things we've been spending a lot of time doing is spending time looking at national legislative arrangements, because you find actually most states have courts, they have legal recognitions of certain rights, and you can sometimes use those avenues to do things, and outsiders can support those inside government to press those issues. So I think we've not yet scratched the surface of the full range of peaceful measures that could be employed that are consistent with existing international law, that don't violate sovereignty, but that could help support protection and prevention. On the second one, is it a milestone? Well, to kind of contradict our debate on procedural or substantive, procedurally it is a milestone, because what it does is it formalizes things. So over the past 10 years, the General Assembly has been having informal dialogues on R2P. And because they're informal, what that means is the statements that states make don't get formally recorded. So we've all had to basically chase up with permanent missions to get their statements, and sometimes you can get them, sometimes you don't. By making it a formal debate, it means all of those statements are formally recorded. So we will have a formal record of what governments have to say about R2P, and it allows, you know, someone mentioned about kind of naming and shaming, and that's very true, but it means that any government can name and shame any other government. So we talk about kind of selectivity. This is the best antidote to selectivity. If we're worried that the West is being selective, then why not ask difficult questions about Western governments, about the US's immigration policy, or Australia's refugee policy, or its indigenous past, and how we're doing or not doing enough to recognize past crimes, to raise questions about the legacies of empire and colonialism, and how these have created some of the root causes of atrocity crimes in some places, and what we're going to do to address that. By putting it on the record in the GA, it creates opportunities for those sorts of discussions. The other thing that this vote does is it requires the General Assembly to report to the it requires the Secretary General to report to the General Assembly. Now, the SG has been doing that informally for the last decade anyway, but also directing those reports to the Security Council as well. This requires the GA, requires the Secretary General to issue a report, and gives the General Assembly a formal opportunity to scrutinize, interrogate, and evaluate what the Secretary General is doing. So if the General Assembly doesn't like the direction the Secretary General is proposing to take R2P or its implementation, the General Assembly can say it doesn't like it. If it thinks the Secretariat needs to be learning lessons and looking at past cases where maybe things didn't go so well, then the General Assembly can instruct the Secretariat to learn lessons, to review. So it is a milestone, and it formalizes a lot of what was happening already informally. But I think, to come back to the point that Lina made, I think what this can do is return R2P to the General Assembly. Like if the General Assembly doesn't take carriage of it, other institutions that are less inclusive and less accountable will take carriage of it. What this does is put the General Assembly back in the center and gives an opportunity to have those debates. And that's, for me personally, that's why I feel that Indonesia's position is unfortunate, because I think it's precisely governments like Indonesia, like South Africa, like Brazil, that have deeply felt humanitarian and human rights concerns, but also have that non-Western and history of colonization. And so those critical concerns that we need to bring to the fore, they have that. And so they can shape the debate. They can make sure those safeguards are there. They can make sure that this is implemented in a way that's sustainable and consistent. And I think there's a real opportunity, as Lina was saying, for leadership through the General Assembly for governments like that. But it would have been nice to have seen Indonesia take that opportunity.
Thank you, Alex. I think that's an excellent point on selectivity, on Indonesia's interests. So actually, Indonesia's interest of having more debates and how to turn the table, so to speak, against the powerful states would have been accomplished had we voted yes rather than voting no. So to some extent, the things that our diplomats have justified publicly to be our interest would have been better accomplished by the yes vote rather than the no vote. And this is interesting because selectivity was cited by a foreign ministry official in a different webinar several weeks ago as a proof that Indonesia is not in favor of selectivity because we are fighting for humanity in those words. And instead, I think what you're saying is that the selectivity could be debated, could be formalized, and to be looked at by a much more inclusive institution. I think that's an excellent point. There is another question. I think this is for all three speakers. I think it's brief, but I think it's important, and I think all three might have different reasoning. The question is simply, is it bad by saying no? My own view is that bad or not depends on the alternative, right? If saying yes and abstaining, you get more interest, then the vote for no is bad. But I believe that all three speakers would have a different reasoning why it's bad to say no. But I think all three would say it is bad. Let me give the floor first to Lina.
Okay, thank you, Evan. I think the question really sum up the main point of having this webinar. I think Alex has made very strong points why it is bad to say no. It is more harmful than bringing benefits, because by moving it as a annual permanent agenda in the UNGA, it's very clear. We can have the formal debates, recorded debates, where we can criticize those what we call as powerful states. Because in our view, I think we all know, there is no country that is having like free or no problem from risk to atrocity. All countries, they have their own problems. So in that sense, I think by having this formal debates, by saying yes, or at least abstain, I think, but I'm favoring is to say yes, because we can really have, as I said earlier, as a dignified debate, where everyone can actually contribute in shaping on how the R2P should be implemented and promoted in the future. And second, this is specific for Indonesia. It's just the wrong time and the wrong place to say no. Because Indonesia, as I mentioned earlier, we are now having very specific agenda to push ASEAN, and especially Indonesia itself, to help the Myanmar people. While, again, they are calling for R2P. You know, because this is a blatant crimes against humanity, what is taking place in Myanmar currently. By saying what we call as procedural resolution, although it's actually not something, because when you mention procedural and substantive, you know, you can't say, oh, this is not important resolution, this is a more important resolution with hundreds of pages, you know, what they call as a substantive resolution. There is no such thing like that. So actually, this is very harmful to our diplomacy in the near future, even not in the near future, what we are currently doing. You know, because again, like we are voting for human rights protection in the region as well as the global level, but we are saying no for R2P to be discussed more and more in the international level. So I think that's two from me. I think other speakers can also add it.
Thank you, Lina. Dr. Bhatara?
Well, I mean, it's the problem and always critics by international law expert that, you know, international law always, is it legally binding, but not enforced. So I mean, that's based on, you know, the experience on Indonesia dealing with some principles or general principles of law or international law. As we can see that, for example, the Rome Statutes, actually this is the, you know, the chance for the opportunity for Indonesia to active in the chamber, while the big or major player in international relations is not in the chamber. And again, the international society is already willing that if you take it or just leave it. I mean, that's like Rome Statute, there is no reservations on this issue. So you take it, you leave it. While in R2P issues, I think, you know, it is good that, you know, this principle is not just, you know, discussed in the normative things, but it should be sound and, you know, it should be more open, discussed in the United Nations General Assembly. As Alex said, that, you know, the states can criticize or even, you know, reject or something in a complaint to the states in the UN Security Council. And I think this is very important to us. So is it a problem to say no? yes, for me, no to impunity is very important. No to atrocities is important. But say no for something good, I think there is something happen in our head and questions and raise questions that why we will, remember in the history, especially in international relations, that Indonesia positions together with the pariah states in this issue, and how Indonesia deal with their own human rights issues. So I think for me, this is actually another doomsday for Indonesian diplomacy, and also it's betray the willing of Indonesians, majority Indonesians, on respecting human rights. Moreover, if Indonesia is willing to defending it, her sovereignty and territorial integrity, this is, I think, one of the important sessions that Indonesia can, debate or giving them more explanation rather than to divert the issues, which is very, for me is a cheap issues. And I think for us, it is very sad that we have to consume this kind of thing and come from our MFA, like the issues of differentiating the substantial and procedural, which is for me, as I said, separating the sugar with the sweetness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Bellamy, would you like to respond a bit?
Very, very quickly, I always like to respond to any question about R2P, as Lina, unfortunately for her, knows. So is voting no bad? Well, it's not bad if you're opposed to R2P. If you don't like R2P, you think the world would be better off without R2P, then vote no. Voting no isn't bad. It's also not bad if you think that R2P shouldn't be debated through the General Assembly. So if you think it's better to have it debated just at the Security Council, for example, or just at the Human Rights Council, or not at the UN at all, then a no vote is fine there. And on that latter point, I mean, two governments that would be comfortable with that are China and the United States. Both of those governments would be quite happy for R2P to just be limited to the Security Council, so they can control it much more, and they don't have to spend very much time listening to what the wider membership has to say. I've had diplomats from both of those countries tell me more than once that they're happy for the whole thing to just be run through the Security Council. And I think the other two speakers have explained why it is a bad thing if you want Indonesia to influence the debate, if you want to address accountability and address selectivity, and if you want to shape and have a role in shaping implementation, you lose that with a pure no vote on a resolution like this, whereas you could have had that by trying to shape the resolution and influence it and put Indonesia at the fore. And I think that is what some of Indonesia's neighbors have achieved. I think it is precisely what Malaysia has achieved. And I think Thailand and even the Philippines have achieved something similar by doing that. Singapore as well. Singapore engaged very constructively in the negotiations, had some issues and stated those issues quite forcefully, as Lina has already said. And those issues have been noted precisely because Indonesia was involved in the negotiations, set out its argument and decided to abstain. And I know for a fact that those on the yes side of the debate are paying close attention to what Singapore said because of the constructive role that it played. And you do have to, at the end of the day, look at who it is you're voting with, that you're voting, not just abstaining, you're voting against Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and you're voting with North Korea and Syria against your closest neighbors. And I think, in the longer term, you do have to look at that and think about, well, what sort of messages are we sending to our friends and neighbors with that sort of vote?
Thank you for that. Once again, a very insightful response. We have two questions. I think because they're similar, I'll try to combine them as one. Now that we cannot change the fact that Indonesia voted no, it's a fact, and the damage has been done. The more the foreign ministry tries to defend the no vote, the more it digs its hole deeper and make things worse. What do we do next? Where do we go from here? If Indonesia, as argued by the official statements, remains committed to the principles of human rights, where do we go from here? If we say that this has implication for Indonesia's foreign policy, including in Myanmar, what sort of follow-up strategy at the UN or elsewhere do we need to come up with to make sure that we can address or minimize those negative repercussions? And similarly, the second question asked, in the past, Indonesia has been known to favor what is known as quiet diplomacy, as it did with the Rohingya issue, for example, rather than the R2P principle. So can Indonesia continue this kind of quiet diplomacy instead of the R2P? Is quiet diplomacy hand in hand with R2P or not? So I think these two things these two questions are tied to one another. What's next, and is quiet diplomacy still part of that next step? First, let me give the floor to Professor Bellamy first.
Thanks very much, and those are really good questions. I'm going to leave the question of what Indonesia should do next. Today's far more qualified than me to speculate and talk about that. So I'll just focus on the quiet diplomacy, because I think that's a really, really good question. And as the questioner implies, the quiet diplomacy is a part of R2P. If you're doing quiet diplomacy to try and resolve a dispute or prevent a dispute or protect civilians, whether you call it R2P or not, guess what? You're doing R2P and you're fulfilling your responsibility to protect. So having said, I'm not going to talk about the first question. Let me wheel around to the first question. If, for example, Indonesia was to say, look, we are quite uncomfortable with some elements of Pillar 3, but look, we think we're really quite good at quiet diplomacy. Let's give CSIS some funding to study when and how it works and how it should be used and what lessons we can learn. And let's make Indonesia one of the central players in doing quiet diplomacy. This could be something that Indonesia contributes. It is a core aspect of R2P. You know, the first successful case of R2P in practice was quiet diplomacy. It then got not so quiet, but it was Kofi Annan in Kenya in 2007, negotiating a resolution of a problem that would have erupted into a civil war in Kenya had Annan not done that. And you can look at the record of people like Annan, Mandela before him in Africa, that there has been a revolution of quiet diplomacy as part of the African Union. Why not do something similar to that in Southeast Asia? Why not say, well, you know what, we're going to focus on quiet diplomacy, and if it works, if you're successful, you reduce the number of times that question of more coercive issues come up, because nobody wants to address, no one wants to think about armed intervention or sanctions. If this can be resolved with diplomacy and through a peace process and political settlement, well, that's better for everybody. And so if Indonesia was to embrace that and become the leader on that, well, that I think would be good for Indonesia and good for R2P. And the more that we can ramp up capacities to do that peaceful political work, the chapter 6 of the UN Charter and the chapter 8 of the UN Charter, the regional work, the better for everyone. R2P gets implemented in a way that's more culturally and legally appropriate for different regions, that addresses problems before they escalate to the point where you need to get the Security Council involved. I think this is exactly the way forward. And it was the vision that Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, of course, had when he was doing his work on R2P and ASEAN. It was all about, let's support ASEAN in building the capacities it needs to address the problems in our region in a way that makes sense to our norms, principles, and procedures, and thus prevent the need for the UN Security Council and others to have to address things later on. So I would say yes to quiet diplomacy, and someone should fund CSIS Indonesia to do some serious work on when it succeeds, when it doesn't succeed, and what can be done to make it better.
Thank you, Professor Bellamy. Dr. Bhatara, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think I don't understand. I really understand what the quiet diplomacy in this thing, but for I do understand based on my experience that, you know, Indonesia is just engaged, but very carefully. I mean, that's especially on Myanmar. I recall when back in 2007, when Indonesia, not individually, at that time as a member of non-permanent member of Security Council, say it's also absent for the issues of Myanmar. So for I think the question, if you think that quiet diplomacy is, you know, is the same word which, you know, not agree with R2P but never mentions about R2P. I think this is very problematic. It's just like you support human rights but never mention on human rights and democracy. So this is another problematic issue. So for me, I think this is Indonesia. It's very significant to Indonesia to have, you know, if consultancy to the stakeholder. So who's the stakeholder? It's civil society. For example, like civil society, you can actually ask, I mean, at the MFA, if they don't understand about what the next step to fix these situations, actually you have a consultancy to, for example, CSIS or other human rights civil society, which is very, very good, where it should be a process for you know, to get, you know, some thought from our public. So it's completely different with this situation. So this is actually I offer to fix for Indonesians on how to deal with very delicate issues, you know, in the issues of human rights or humanitarian crisis. So Indonesia has a good positions and give a robust explanations to our public and also international in the international fora, that our position is very clear, that we support human rights, and also in the same words, we also support the actions and involve it in the real world. So that's actually we want to fix these situations. Thank you.
And I see that there's no more questions. So Lina, you have the last word.
Okay, thank you. I think I want to keep it also on the quiet diplomacy versus out. But my opinion is, yes, we are undertaking quiet diplomacy, but it does not mean we don't make our standpoint. Why I'm saying this, I give you an example. Back then, when Foreign Minister Hassan Wirayuda, when he met his counterpart during the Nargis situation in Myanmar, he used the word R2P as a bargaining chip to the military junta at that time, saying, okay, you have three options. First, you can do whatever you want. Okay. Second, you can work with ASEAN. Or third, if you don't want to work with ASEAN, you can just wait for R2P to come into your country. So you better consider that. So we don't say it out loud in the public, but we still mention R2P in a private conversation to say that this is something, the principle, the international principle, that you cannot disregard, actually. So again, quiet diplomacy doesn't mean that we are not saying anything. Okay, and on the question of what next, I have to be very frank on this. I think Indonesia should stop giving explanation to justify the no vote. Stop making excuse, because the more, as Evan mentioned earlier, the more you explain, the more you dig your own hole. And the more you say that Indonesia is having substantive problem to R2P. And that is very damaging to our credibility as we are building our credibility and image as a peace builder, contributor to the peace and whatsoever. And second, doing it by action. Join the debates. Join the formal debates. Criticize whomever you want to criticize. But by criticizing that, criticize yourself. trying to look at what is the problem within Indonesia itself, that making us so inconfident to our own position itself towards R2P. Because as Bhatara mentioned in his presentation, it is very clear that most of the problems is internal. Why we are not confident, why we are being so paranoid with R2P, it's because of our own problems. And again, this responsibility to protect is the responsibility of all states, all governments, to protect its own populations. So I think that's the only thing that the Indonesian government can do to mend these problems, to fix these problems. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lina. I know we're a bit early, but I believe some of our speakers have prior engagement. So with that, I would like to end today's webinar. First, let me say thank you once again to Professor Bellamy, to Dr. Bhatara for their gracious time and for their insightful comments and presentations that I believe is important, not just for our diplomats to hear, but for the Indonesian public to be made aware as well. As discussed earlier, foreign policy is not the purview of the elites, it is the purview of the Indonesian people as well. Thank you once again for attending yet another round of a CSIS webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in more events in the future. Good morning, stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you,
Thank
Bhatara.
you very much.
Thank you.
See you, Alex. Thank you. Bye, Lina.